Good day. Welcome, everyone. Thank you all for coming. On behalf of the Mitchell Lions Club, and I want to acknowledge that this is our 100th year of service here in the Mitchell community, and it's part of the reason that we have a series of speakers coming from the state capitol to bring information from peer to our local community. So we're honored to have Secretary Sanderson be our speaker today, and we welcome each and every one of you. We want to give a special thanks to the administration and the faculty here at Dakota Wesleyan, Dr. Creasy, Friedel, everyone that we've worked with. Nathan Putman, the food service director, has been so accommodating at putting these lunches together and with the numbers changing all along the way. So we want to acknowledge his efforts, Dixie's efforts for changing the room 3 times for us to meet in so that the space would hold today's gathering. And we want to thank everyone here at Dakota Wesleyan. We also want to welcome everyone else that's here. We have representatives from Mitchell Technical College here in Mitchell. We have the Mitchell Public Schools Administration and School Board represented with us here today. We have the Mitchell Chamber of Commerce honoring us with their presence. We have a number of service clubs for our community who have members who are here today because of their interest in our young people and their futures. We have the Palace City Lions, the Rotary Club, Kiwanis. I want to give a little shout out for Kiwanis. This is also their 100th year of service to the Mitchell community, so we want to give them that special recognition. The Exchange Club is here. PEO has some members who are here to learn about education in the future that we're working toward for our students here in South Dakota. We also have former and current teachers, and we have the Education Department from the university here at Dakota Wesleyan with the chairman, Ashley Dingman, Dr. Ashley Dingman. Welcome. The one wonderful thing about today is that all of you guests and all of you are concerned about South Dakota's most precious commodity. It's our students and their futures. And as South Dakota State used to say, you can go anywhere from here. But it's our goal as South Dakota, as a legislator and as Secretary of Education, that we create the opportunities so that that our students not only can go anywhere from here, but those opportunities can be found right here in South Dakota. We want to know that through learning, through innovative learning, bold leadership, intentional faith, and genuine service, we can create opportunities to keep these great faces here in our state in these great places. So with that having been said, thank you all for your help. Thank you all for attending. And if you would join me now, I'm going to have campus pastor Eric Van Meter share our invocation with us to start the day.
Will you join me in prayer? O God, our wisdom on high, by you the meek are guided in judgment, and light rises up in darkness. Grant us in our doubts and uncertainties the grace to ask what you would have us to do, that we may be saved from false choices, that in your light we may see light, and in your straight path may not stumble. Through Jesus Christ our Savior. Amen.
Now I'd ask us all to rise and face the flag and join me in the Pledge of Allegiance to our flag. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you all. We're going to dispense with any club meeting proceedings today, and we're going to move right on. So I'd like to start by giving you our speaker's bio for today. Tiffany Sanderson serves as the Secretary of Education. Prior to her current role, Tiffany was Senior Policy Advisor in the Governor's Office, focusing on K-12 higher education, Bureau of Human Resources, and Bureau of Information and Telecommunications. She also led the governor's workforce efforts. Tiffany graduated from Lemon High School and earned her bachelor degree in agricultural education from South Dakota State University, and her master's degree in human resource management from the University of South Dakota. Tiffany's career has spanned education, youth development, workforce development. In her early career, she worked with National FFA organization in Indianapolis, a learning solutions company, Vivaic Incorporated, based in Lincoln, Nebraska, and the South Dakota Department of Education. While at the department, Tiffany led career and technical education, including the state's 4 technical colleges. Tiffany lives in Pierre with her husband, Nathan, the executive director of a statewide trade organization, and their son, Carter, the director of their free time. She enjoys time with her family and friends, adventure in the outdoors, traveling, running, and supporting community events. Would you help me in welcoming Secretary of Education Tiffany Sanderson?
Good afternoon. One more time, good afternoon. I am so honored to be with you this afternoon, and Representative, thanks for the invitation to join you today. I have the privilege of working with the representative in Pierre. He serves on the House Education Committee and is always asking thoughtful questions, offering really good insights to the process. So it's been a joy to work with you on education policy, and we'll get back together in just a few months down the road here. It's hardly possible that we're already looking ahead to legislative session 2022. It is a joy to be here. I have always enjoyed my time in Mitchell. I've had a chance to visit with several people today about the Mitchell community, and the representative talked about my time with career and technical education. I've had the opportunity to work with Dr. Graves and the Mitchell Tech crew on all sorts of projects over time in the career and technical education space, and every time that I'm here, it's really exciting. There is something special about the Mitchell community and the way that people come together here, collaborate, communicate, work on community-wide efforts. The sauce that's here in Mitchell is not present everywhere. So one, treasure what you have, and know that I celebrate you and the work that you do together in this community. A century of service, both for Lions Club and Kiwanis Club here in Mitchell. I think that being able to celebrate that milestone, 100 years of service to the people and students and young people in this community, says something about the folks who make up the fabric of the Mitchell community. Congratulations on that legacy, and thanks again for making time for me to be here and share it with you today. My hope is that together we can talk a little bit about education in South Dakota, where things are currently at, especially with the impacts of COVID across the state, and what's on the horizon for education. So I'll share some of where we're at here, and then open up the floor for some questions and answer conversation around education. So that's kind of the lay of the land as we look forward. 19 months ago, we thought we were on a 100-meter dash to address COVID and what popped up in March of 2020. 19 months later, we're finding ourselves on an ultramarathon in the education community of figuring out how do we continue to educate our students and prioritize their learning and their development in the face of the COVID impact in our schools. Early on, that was all about emergency management, making sure that we had cleaning supplies and PPE and address the needs of online instruction in the last quarter of the 2020 school year. Last year was a combination of how do we prioritize in-person instruction for our students and continue their learning while also mitigating the disease. This school year seems to have found us in a place of addressing workforce challenges and supply chain issues. So all of that in total has made for a really interesting time in the education community. If you ask any teacher or school leader about why they entered education, it probably was not to deal with the factors that have come together over the last couple of years. But I am ever an optimist and love that we've been challenged in this way, because it's really pushed us into a space of how do we do education better as we go forward. Disruption can sometimes be a really positive thing, and I choose the silver lining of this last couple of years to be a challenge as we go forward to do even better for our kids and their futures. Our teachers have been amazing. Our school leaders have been amazing over the last couple of years. In fact, you probably recognize some of them on the screen, some Mitchell Middle School teachers. Just a couple of photos from what schools have looked like over the last couple of years. In the left-hand side, that's a picture of as students were in virtual learning in the spring of 2020, schools were providing meals, breakfast, lunches for multiple days at a time, and drive-up events like this were a common sight in schools delivering those meals. We had teachers visiting students in safe ways to make sure that education continued, and when a student needed help, they received the support that they needed. Graduation ceremonies and celebrations certainly looked different the last couple of years, but how cool for students to have a parade in recognizing their achievements in the first 18 years of their life. A few more folks might look familiar on this site. The Regional Teacher of the Year, just across the campus here, parades to celebrate student learning and education, and teaching kindergarteners how to learn and read and do math and all of the skills that set the foundation for learning via Zoom. So though it's been challenging and many moments of stress, I am so incredibly grateful for our educators and the way that they have helped to teach our students adaptability and resilience and persistence over the course of these last couple of years. I think that that's one of the great things of this time, is that our young people have seen firsthand examples of adults in their lives who they trust being able to respond to challenging times and stressful situations. I think that our students are going to take that into their futures in ways that young people in the past, those of us in the room, may not have had the opportunity to do in the past. So if you see a teacher, thank a teacher. If you see a school leader, school board member, thank them for their service and their work. They have really gone to incredible lengths to make sure that our kids and their futures are at the forefront and learning continues over this time. In fact, I know we've got several in the room here. Let's give them a round of applause. Let's talk a little bit about what the numbers look like for education in South Dakota. Across the state, we have 149 public school districts, and between private schools and tribal and BIE schools, just over 200 school districts across the state. And on top of that, we've got some special programs like special schools. We've got the School for the Blind and Visually Impaired, education cooperatives that school districts receive special education services and other specialized services from, and other approved programs. So think programs like education at Aurora Plains Academy or Children's Home Society. We work with all of those providers and school districts in serving our kids. I think it's fascinating to look at school districts in this way. Our smallest school district has less than a dozen students in it in the far southwest corner of the state, all the way over in Arking to Sioux Falls, our largest district with 24,000 students. So as we make decisions around education in South Dakota and the House Education Committee considers policy, we have to think about education at a statewide level across all of the different varied looks, from a dozen students to 24,000 students. And making education policy in that space can sometimes be challenging. Hear, hear? These numbers are from a year ago this time. The fall 2021 census count, the number of students in our schools, is currently being validated. So I don't have those numbers quite yet. In another couple of weeks, we'll have those to share out. But last year, we had about 136,000 students who were enrolled in public schools and another 14,500 who were enrolled in non-public schools. So again, that's private schools, tribal, and BIE schools across the state. COVID impacts, a whole bunch of them. We're seeing it in the workforce, we're seeing it in supply chains, we're seeing it in our classrooms. And as you're all familiar, there have been federal funds that have come to South Dakota in a variety of ways to support different efforts in recovery, addressing the COVID impact, the disease itself, Department of Health, the Bureau of Finance and Management, Department of Education, many others have received funds to address COVID in one way or another. In South Dakota, our state education budget, state dollars and federal dollars combined, totals about $850 million every year. Over the course of this last year, altogether, we've received about $750 million in one-time funds connected to COVID. So it's a tremendous amount of funding that's come to South Dakota to support education, to support mitigation efforts over the course of the next couple of years. The $750 million will largely be spent this year and next year, and a portion of it continues through the fall of 2024. So most of it is quick turn funding, but there is some of it with a little more extension on it. Within the Department of Education, we have our K-12 services. We also have the State Library, Child and Adult Nutrition Services, and the State Historical Society. So we have a variety of education happening, some of it in schools, some of it in communities. The large portion of our funding that has come from the federal government is focused on K-12. That's at $713 million. A small sliver in comparison going to nutrition programs and library services. Those numbers are still significant numbers if we think about one-time funds for the different programs in the state. If you want to dig into the details on any of this, and you can find out information on what the Mitchell School District has received, or Mount Vernon, or Ethan, feel free to join on our website. You'll see on the banner across the top a federal funding piece, and you can go in and look at any of the distributions that have been made out to school districts. I should mention that of this $713 million, 90% of that has flowed directly to school districts, to public schools. And a small portion is required to be held at the state for state-level programming, and I'll talk about what that looks like here in just a moment. Related to this last round of funding that came out in March of 2021, the state was required to put together a plan, and you've probably, school board members, you've worked on your plan here locally of how Mitchell School District is going to invest funds. Part of that requirement is consultation with stakeholders. We were required to do the same thing at the state level. And so through the consultation process, some of that happened informally. We're consistently talking with school superintendents, school board members, leaders in buildings, teachers in classrooms, and we also, apart from the informal, went out for public comment in a more formal way and asked the question, how should South Dakota invest this funding that we've received through COVID, through the federal education stabilization dollars? And this isn't surprising. It really reinforces what we had been hearing on an informal basis. The public in South Dakota really wanted schools, the state, to address learning loss, engage students, and address mental health needs that students are experiencing. Some support for educator professional development, and just a little bit of support for school facilities and COVID mitigation. But largely, what we see is support for addressing learning loss that students had experienced, engaging students, and I'll talk more about attendance and what we saw this last year, and then addressing mental health needs. So probably no surprises to anybody in this room. From all the public comment and what we had seen in terms of impacts to schools and students' learning, we submitted a plan to the feds that was approved in early July and set out 3 priorities. And these are the priorities you're going to be hearing about in terms of education in South Dakota through the next 3 school years. We're supporting strong instruction and educational opportunities for students, so great teachers, great opportunities for our kids, addressing students' social, emotional, and mental health needs, and then addressing educator workforce needs, both from a recruitment standpoint and retention. What does that mean? Supporting strong instruction and educational opportunities. As we go forward, the professional development that our educators have access to or are invited to participate in is going to shift face. Much of the past experience was teachers getting together on site somewhere to learn at the same time, or gathering as a school staff and all learning the same thing at the same time. We'll be taking a page from what Mitchell has done here around personalized learning and setting up a platform for educators with professional development that they can choose from. So on time, in the moment needs. Teachers from classroom to classroom in a building are often needing different learning or have different priorities, and this, as we go forward, this platform will allow them to do that. Educational opportunities. We'll talk in a second about the disengagement we saw for some students and families over the course of last year for a variety of reasons. So as we go forward, we know that we need to have flexible options for students to complete their high school education, get ready for post-secondary work or the career force, and make sure that they've got the skills and abilities to succeed and earn good livings here in South Dakota. Also, helping our middle school students or upper elementary students explore their opportunities. So think summer career camps that our students can take part in and explore their options for their futures. Addressing students' social, emotional, and mental health needs. One example of what we've started in this space is a partnership with the Department of Social Services and offering telehealth equipment to schools free of charge so that when school counselors or mental health professionals aren't available in the building on demand, students can get the resources that they need in partnership between the family and the school with folks at a distance. So that mental health service is a great new opportunity for South Dakota schools. And I'm sure you've heard in the news challenges in finding substitute teachers, in finding school leaders. We've got a great opportunity to build the teacher pipeline in South Dakota and invite all sorts of folks to the profession. It's a wonderful profession to be a part of, whether that's a young person in high school looking to start their career or someone who's been in a career for a long time and looking to re-career. There are opportunities in education to welcome them to the field on the recruitment side. We have about 10,000 teachers in South Dakota. I'd like to keep those 10,000 teachers in South Dakota, and so these efforts will continue to support retention efforts as well. Where are we now? There's a couple of resources that I invite you to dig into if you'd like to learn more information, but I'll share the highlights with you this afternoon. This summer, we published a report on the impact of COVID. So we worked with school districts, and they provided a ton of information to us about how they operated last year, how they mitigated the disease, how they provided remote or virtual education to their students, the impacts on student learning, and then a piece of where we go next is included in that report. And then also last week, the 2020-2021 report card was released, and I'm guessing either at recent school board meeting or an upcoming school board meeting, there'll be a discussion on Mitchell's report card for this last year. A really unique report card year because of COVID and some of the waivers from the U.S. Department of Education or flexibility that they gave us in terms of what was reported out. But let's talk a little bit about what we know of COVID's impact across the state. We know that almost 90% of schools had students in person last year. I have an opportunity to visit with other chief state school officers across the country on a weekly and monthly basis. That number is not the norm. South Dakota truly is special and unique in that we prioritized in-person student learning last year and mitigated the disease at the same time. As you know, many other states didn't take that same approach and are reopening their buildings this year and struggling to help catch students up. I'll be the first to say that we have challenges going forward, that we have to support and help our students where they're at and in their learning as we look ahead. But we are in a really good position compared to many other states. So I, again, applaud our South Dakota educators on the efforts that they took on this last couple of years. If you look at just public schools, this 90% represents public and non-public schools. If you just look at public schools, more than 90% of our schools had most students in person last year. And you can see at this top line is the in-person instruction, and then at the bottom, a combination of fully remote or a hybrid or modified schedule that schools were offering. So with the waxing and waning of COVID last year, you can see where the big spike was in November of 2020. And then schools from there started to bring students back in larger numbers in person. One of the other special things that happened last year in response to COVID was schools offering multiple ways for students to access education. In-person options, fully virtual options, and some kinds of hybrid options in between where there's a combination of in-person and virtual. More than half of our school buildings, we've got 800 school buildings across the state, more than half of them offered a fall and spring virtual option for their students and families. And there was about 30% that didn't make that available. You can see that most Middle and junior high schools offered that option, and high schools, not as much as the elementary or our specialized schools, which makes sense. It's more difficult to teach and learn in a virtual environment when you're learning the basics, math, reading, social studies, science. You're probably familiar with this. This is what COVID looked like in our school buildings for students and for educators last year, the staff and students. That spike that happened in November, and then numbers fell after that. On an incident rate, we were far below the general population across the state, only about 7% incident rate within our school buildings. So all of the mitigation efforts, hand washing, distancing, plexiglass barriers that were offered in school districts, all of that in combination really helped to promote an environment that was healthy for students where they could learn. And we're seeing small case numbers this fall. Certainly some districts have seen larger impacts than others. And as the disease has evolved, similar to the flu, we don't have as clear of numbers on COVID's impact in schools right now. These are the numbers reported to the Department of Health, but we're providing at-home testing options for our students and their families this year, and so those numbers aren't necessarily reflected here. But the good news is incident rate is low and students are able to continue learning. One of the questions I get asked a lot is, so what did happen? Was there learning loss? How were, as students were out of school or back and forth between isolation and quarantine, how did that impact them? Were they learning the same way that they used to? This is information that school leaders shared with us over the course of the summer, and their perception on learning loss or the impact to learning. For the most part, in a standard year, our school leaders said that all of our students or most of our students were able to stay on track, stay at grade level. In person last year, we saw much the same thing, which isn't surprising. In remote learning and virtual learning, there were obviously some challenges. Schools did their best to make a quick shift, but we know that it's not the best option for the majority of students. It is a good option for several students. So this is what they perceived to be the impact of this last year on student learning. What we saw in the statewide report card was the actual assessment data for math and English, and that supported what school leaders were sharing with us. The student performance levels were down slightly from where they've been in the past, but even more telling, not as many students participated in those assessments. Again, think quarantine, isolation periods, ability to be in school. There were some of our public schools on tribal reservations where tribal ordinances had them learning online, and they weren't able to take the assessment, and so we saw an impact to learning in those areas. Here's some of the most interesting and telling information for me, and I hope that it's interesting and telling for all of you as well. I think this is an action point for all of us as we go forward. In a typical year, we look at chronic absenteeism. So for students who are in a school for the year, which of those students are missing 10 days or more? And that often helps us understand there's a correlation between if you miss 10 days or more of school, your ability to stay on track for grade level or for graduation. With all of the factors last year, we wanted to see how many students had long-term absences. Obviously, that would indicate that those are the students with the highest level needs. In an average year, we've got a little over 3% of our students who miss 30 or more days of the school year. 30 days is about half of a quarter. It's a tremendous amount of time in terms of instruction and learning in the classroom. Last year, that number was above 6%. Of our 136,000 students, almost 8,700 of them missed 30 or more days. Those are unexcused absences. So a tremendous increase in students who were disengaged from their learning for one reason or another. So as an educator, that tells me we've got our work cut out for us to re-engage those students, re-engage those families in learning, help meet them where they're at, and help them learn as they go forward. There were some of our subgroups of students who were more impacted than others. For instance, about a third of our students in South Dakota come from low-income families. But of students who missed 30 or more days last year, it was 70% of those 8,700 students. Similarly, you can see in the Native American students, our high school students, special education, and Hispanic students. were more likely to be disengaged this last year. Now, my hope is as we're seeing enrollment numbers come in this year, that we're seeing many of those students come back. But the students I want you to think about and walk out of this room with today are students who might be 15, 16, 17 years old, who have credits as a 9th or 10th grader. If I'm 17 years old and I needed to take care of younger siblings or get a job this last year and I wasn't able to attend school in the same way, it's going to be very difficult for me from the point in time that I'm at in my life to make up those credits and graduate high school on time. And so as educators, we need to be thinking about how can we meet that student where they're at and provide some flexible options. Mitchell is known for earn and learn opportunities, apprenticeship programs, pre-apprenticeship, work-based learning, internships. Those are phenomenal opportunities for students to get real-life skills, be on a track to make good money as an adult and have the experiences and education that they need. So I commend what you all have been doing for decades now as a model to help meet students where they're at, especially as we're thinking about our young people who are in a transitionary point in their lives and need the skills, need the experience to succeed as adults. Here's kind of how the high rates of absenteeism looked across the state. I shared with you that there were several tribes that had ordinances in place for virtual instruction only, and that's reflected in several of these areas. And then there were some areas where there are many English language learners, low-income families that were also disproportionately impacted. So these are school districts as they're investing in their educational programming through federal dollars that are making investments to meet those students where they're at. Dr. Graves, I was looking at your federal request and prioritizing interventionists and out-of-school instructional supports for your students, which are terrific ways to re-engage those students and help meet them where they're at. So I commend the work really identifying the problem and the issues that students are facing and helping them to support them in their education journey. So the big question is, where do we go from here? That's the big question. We're at a crossroads and have an opportunity to look forward, do education better than we have in the past, emerge stronger from the pandemic than we were before. I mentioned to you our priorities: strong instruction and educational opportunities, supporting our students with social emotional learning and mental health needs, and then supporting our educator workforce, both welcoming new professionals in and keeping those professionals that we have. Right now, there's an attendance campaign running. So this relates to that high rates of absenteeism we saw across the state, that 30 days or more. Don't skip your future. The message is if students are skipping school, they're missing out on their futures. And so hopefully we're able to have a conversation across the state about the value of education, the value of preparing for our futures. You and I probably aren't going to hear a lot of this campaign. You might hear a PSA on the radio here and there. Most of the campaign is targeted at families and high school students. And so if you're on Pandora or other streaming services, you might hear some ads either in Spanish or in English. And if you're a student, high school age, your Snapchat, your Instagram, TikTok are going to see social media about Don't Skip Your Future. We've seen really good click-through rates from our high school age students from the social media over to resources on the Department of Education's website, which connects them into several learning opportunities. So I'm hopeful that that helps. That is just one very small piece, though, of re-engaging students and families. In August, we gathered about 70 professionals from across the state. These are nonprofit education leaders, community service providers, educators, school leaders, higher education staff, and asked the question, how do we re-engage students and families? How do we provide summer and after-school programming? Because at a state level, we're required to invest funds in summer and after-school programming. And how do we best recruit and retain our educator workforce? Phenomenal conversations. It was just a powerhouse of folks gathered around tables trying to knock out solutions for the department's consideration. So I'm really grateful for the time and energy those folks invested. They really helped lay groundwork and a path forward for the department over the next couple of years and asked some really good questions that we're going to need to continue conversations on. But the state level funding that South Dakota has, the information that they provided to us will be very helpful as we go forward. 3 criteria that they were asked to help us with. Let's address real needs that we know based on the impact of COVID and where education is at. How do we measure any changes or lags? There are going to be some situations where we invest in efforts and we don't see the expected results. How do we recognize early that we're not seeing expected results and make changes midstream as we need to? And then how do we impact beyond the life of the funding? I shared with you that $750 million is one-time funds. It has an end life 3 years from now. So we've got a short window of time to make generational impact. And how do we make sure that what we're investing in lasts far beyond the 3 years of funding available? And that's where you come in. At the local level, how can you all help and support these efforts going forward? Support your educators in the school district, here at DWU, Mitchell Technical College, the schools across the region. Please be bold. Please be real about what our students' needs are and what community needs are here. Let's make the differences. We've got tremendous opportunity in front of us, and have always respected Dr. Graves' leadership, and especially over the last couple of years. His voice in the calm way to help us navigate the waters forward is tremendous. So Dr. Graves, thanks for your work. Thanks for your leadership in this space. Another area where, as we're looking ahead in education, you might be wondering about, you've probably heard in the news about social studies standards recently and might be asking the question, what's going on that front? So here's the process that we've been through and what is happening going forward. Over the course of this last summer, a work group got together and worked on social studies standards. Every 5 to 7 years in each content area, a work group gets together. It's a combination of educators at the K-12 level, higher education, community members. In this case, it included historians and professionals who work in the social studies disciplines. So think history, public administration, geography, economics. The recommendations that they made to the department were considered, and the department made some changes to their recommendations and proposed those to the Board of Education Standards. And in the news, we heard a lot of opinions, very passionate opinions about what should or shouldn't be happening within social studies. And so you might have also seen that the governor asked the department to postpone that process, to reconsider the process. And so that's the point that we're at right now. We'll be going to the Board of Education Standards with an update on our path forward in the coming weeks and share what the plan forward will look like. I think all of us would say, from what we've heard in the process, that everybody's voice needs to be heard. And what I love about what's happening right now is that South Dakotans care about what's happening in classrooms. And so I think that's one of the things about COVID. People are more engaged in what's happening in classrooms, and that's a good thing. We can have open conversations and make sure that through this longer consideration period, we're able to do it right. We're able to hear people's voices and continue to rely on professionals to craft those standards as we go forward. So I don't have details to share with you today in terms of the exact process, but we'll be sharing that out with the Board of Education Standards in the coming weeks here. Again, Representative, thank you so much for this opportunity. I appreciate being able to share out with you where education is in the state, how COVID has impacted our South Dakota classrooms, and what our opportunities are going forward. What does our time look like here? How long do we have together?
Till 1 o'clock.
Okay, well, we've got about 15 minutes for questions and answers. So who's got a couple of questions we could start with? Yeah, go ahead.
What have we learned as a result of COVID about the benefits, weaknesses of remote learning? That you can share with us.
If you weren't able to hear the question was, what have we learned through COVID about the benefits or advantages, what works well with remote or virtual education? Do they represent that okay? So many things, and there's educators in the room, and I'd love to have them weigh in on this as well. I mentioned it as we were talking about virtual education being offered in schools. Virtual education isn't for every student. It's really a good option for some students, but it requires a lot of discipline by a young person to connect and to engage in an environment where the interpersonal connection can't happen as readily. Teachers have made the switch very quickly in a lot of cases and done as well as they could. Some teachers are very well trained and equipped to offer virtual instruction, and others were learning as they were going. Teaching in a virtual environment is not the same as teaching in a classroom, and I'm seeing some nodding of the heads over here. So I think that's at the core of what we've learned, right? It's a different methodology, and we need to plan differently for really quality virtual instruction than we do for in-person instruction, and make sure that students who are accessing virtual education are a good fit and they're completely ready for that environment. DWU staff, I'm interested in your perspectives. What would you add?
I agree. I felt like we went into crisis mode. You know, I really didn't feel like it was a true virtual learning experience. It was crisis education. What can we do to best support those kids?
I think in K-12 also the parent involvement is really big when it comes to virtual learning, making sure the parents are there, helping the student, and sometimes that's not always possible if both parents are working. So I think that kind of leads to a little bit of issue with sometimes the virtual learning.
Yeah, Donna.
As college level educators, it was a lot easier for us than it was for K-12.
Sure.
And it was a struggle for some of our students too. But K-12, especially the younger students, virtual learning can be a lot more of a challenge.
One plus, though, was I had children that were home because they were on quarantine, and of course, quarantine was 2 weeks. They didn't miss anything, and I thought that was a plus because they were. Oh, I'm sorry. Children that were home on quarantine did not miss anything. They were able to go to music class. They were able to go to art class. They were able to be a part of the education program, which was a plus to me, and I was a former educator too, that they didn't miss out on the instruction. A worksheet doesn't complement. It does not compare to instruction. So there was some benefits for those who were able to do it that way.
Yeah.
As long as I have this, I have a question for you.
Great. Good transition.
Yes. As a former educator, I've always been very interested in early childhood education. If we don't prepare these children, we know that that is the time when they are ready and willing to learn so much. What are we doing as South Dakota Education Department to have statewide pre-K education?
Great question. I was in Rapid City a couple of weeks ago. Pinedale Elementary was recognized as a distinguished school in the state, and had a chance to visit with Dr. Simon, who's the superintendent out there. And Dr. Graves, I'd be interested in what you're seeing with your kindergartners this year. But Dr. Simon shared with me that 40% of their students came into kindergarten ready for kindergarten, meaning 60% didn't have the skills that they would normally see kindergartners coming to the classroom with. So I think that wasn't represented here, but one of the impacts of COVID is for our little ones, our 3 and 4-year-olds, their interaction in interpersonal ways, their experience with adults and older kids wasn't the same as what kids before them had seen and learned. And so I think we're in a really unique position because of that, and the need is even greater than it has been in the past for those little ones to have really strong pre-K education. So what are we doing in South Dakota? In our Department of Education, we have the Birth to 3 program, and we also are liaisons with the federal Head Start programs. And those folks are currently working with Department of Social Services, who license preschool facilities, to bring our services together and make sure that our expectations for educators and for providers is in sync and streamlined as a foundational piece to make sure that we've got quality expectations for learning that happens with our educators and quality expectations for the facilities and the environment that students are learning in. And to your question, you're probably thinking, well, that doesn't really answer my question. What are we doing to offer statewide? Before we can move to any higher levels of offering pre-K in South Dakota, that step has to happen. And I'd be remiss if I weren't recognizing the school districts that are offering preschool programs to 3- and 4-year-olds, both for special education students and for general education students within their buildings. We're seeing a shift around all sorts of services, preschool education, after-school programming, summer school programming, as schools are recognizing the needs in their communities and making more services available. So there's more to happen on that front, but I feel confident that we're taking the right first steps in that process.
Would you share, Secretary Sanderson, how ACEs or adverse childhood events impact our schools in South Dakota and the ability of these young people to learn that experience these adverse events in their home?
Great question. I wish I could phone a friend right now. My sister-in-law, Carrie Sanderson, leads this effort in the state and is much better versed and articulate on this subject. But I shared with you that one of our priorities in education going forward is addressing social emotional learning, mental health needs, and that comes down to ACEs, or students experiencing trauma in their lives and being able to navigate that and work through it with professional supports and with their own persistence and courage. Part of what we're doing in that priority, some of the federal funding is going to support training for our educators called CAST training, and that helps them to understand how trauma impacts student learning and students' lives and be able to navigate that in the classroom well. Trauma has a tremendous impact on kids, and as we think about students' needs, we often think about them in tiers, tier 1, 2, and 3. Students in tier 1, think of a middle schooler who broke up with a boyfriend, girlfriend, and it's the end of the world as they know it. We can deal with that in the moment and help give them some love and support before that escalates to a higher level. Fast forward to level 3 types of trauma, and those are students who are in a crisis mode, living in crisis, and dealing with that as their first priority. They can't get to a place of learning because they have other needs that need to be addressed first. And so our schools are helping to navigate all of those needs that students have, or all of the moments that they're in on a personal level. And that doesn't just come down to a school counselor or to a school psychologist. All educators have a role to recognize where students are at and help support them. That doesn't mean that the biology teacher is suddenly a school psychologist. That means that a biology teacher can recognize when a student is in a moment of need and connect them to the resources that they need. So very much a part of the fabric at this point of schools, helping students in moments of trauma and at earlier stages, tier 1 stages, to meet their needs. Thanks for that question.
I'd just like to add that it goes from hunger at home to parental conflict to abuse of these children. It's very single-parent families with no father in the home. So all these have impacts on the student's ability to learn.
That's right.
If I could, one more question, please. And it has to do with the presentation that we received in education from Huron, Wagner, and Dubrook schools on the diversity, not just the size or number of students, but the diversity of our school districts in South Dakota and the challenges they face.
Very much so. I'm interested to see the breakdown of demographics in the 2020 census results for South Dakota in detailed ways. Just have seen high-level information at this point. But certainly if you were to put all 136,000 kids across South Dakota schools in one room and open up the doorway, the students that you would see in that classroom are very different than the classrooms that most of us in this room experienced as young people. Take one subpopulation of our students as an example. If you were to bring all of the English learners in South Dakota together, we'd have about 6,500 students. I showed you that map of South Dakota, the sizes of the districts. 6,500 English learners in South Dakota would be our 3rd largest district. That's a tremendous number of students who are coming to our schools, learning English and trying to learn science and math and the whole gamut all at the same time. South Dakota is doing a really nice job in that space. You mentioned Huron. They've been a leader in addressing English learner needs across the last decade. You might have seen that Harrisburg School District, Explorer Elementary, was just recognized as a distinguished school in South Dakota. In the last couple of years, they have closed the gap for their English learners, meaning students who came into kindergarten not knowing English now know English and are academically at grade level with their peers. And so I'm really proud of schools that are recognizing the population of students that they have and helping them to learn and develop.
Question about homeschooling.
Yeah.
Each year, I'm well aware of the fact that there are people who do a really good job with that, and I see National Spelling Bee champions and National Geography champions who have been homeschooled. However, my concern in the real world in my school was not impressive. It was simply like a cop-out. The students stayed home, got to sleep in late, spend their day play video games. My question is, how many students in South Dakota are homeschooled, and is there any accountability? And with the family issues that we have, single-parent families, and in South Dakota, I think we have a very high percentage of working moms, so that's my concern.
Yeah, thank you for the question. In this last legislative session, there was a bill, Senate Bill 177, that changed some of the alternative instruction or homeschool laws here in South Dakota. And so I would say at first, in the spirit of that legislative package, is that parents, moms, dads, families, should be able to make decisions about how their students are educated. That was at the heart of that package. And so in South Dakota, a family can choose alternative instruction, public education, private education, tribal BIE, if that's available to them, all as options for their kids' education. And homeschool families notify the department and their local school district of their intent to provide that instruction. From a truancy or is education happening standpoint, school districts are responsible for the students who are enrolled in their buildings and any school-age students attending some kind of education. So to play that out, if Dr. Graves knows that there is a family that has school-age children, but they haven't enrolled in the school district and he hasn't received a notification for homeschool for that family, his staff is responsible for contacting that family and inviting them to participate in education. Of course, there are all sorts of accountability options for truancy and other factors after that as well. But that's kind of the landscape in terms of families' decision-making around the ways to educate their kids.
First of all, thank you for a great presentation. My son teaches in Chamberlain, and is there any way the state or we as parents and community members, how could we get involved to involve parents more in their children's education? We're touching on a lot of those areas with challenged home situations with single parents and working mothers and things like that. But one of the things my son talks about is apathy among parents. And is there a way we can try to encourage parents to take a more active and proactive role in their child's education?
It's a great question. It's going to take all of us in this room and more to figure out exactly how to make that happen. So in the absence of a big one solution, there are a whole bunch of really small solutions, right? It's everything from those of us in the room sharing our time and energy in school buildings, whether that's serving as a substitute, volunteering in mentoring programs, and mentoring programs are for students. Mentoring programs are for young families often. So there's really good opportunities there. Reading in classrooms or reading in public library spaces, as those opportunities are available, I think it's on all of us to engage in whatever way we can to share our time and energy with our school system and to support families where they're at and with what their needs are in educating their kids. I'm a huge believer in little kids having an opportunity to be read to. That 20 minutes a day at home, young years, makes a huge and tremendous difference going forward. So if there are programs in Mitchell to get books at well child visits so they can go home with families with some encouragement from mom and dad to sit down and read, make the connection to spaces like we're in today, libraries. They would look a little different, obviously, for our little people, but just continuing to make those connections of the opportunities that exist right here and all of us sharing time and energy. I've got time for one more.
Thank you, Tiffany, for coming, and we appreciate your excellent work for our state, and I just appreciate your public service very much. And I want to go back to the social studies standards. Oh, yay. But I, as a person that, what do I know about this? I read the newspaper, right? But from that vantage point, I've had conversations with friends, some of them Indigenous. And the impression out there is that the work group did great work. They were excited about it. It had a robust component of Indigenous studies, and that got minimized for perhaps political reasons. So that caused an uproar, and now it's been scrapped and starting over again. So first of all, is that a false impression? Set me right. Secondly, why don't we just go back to what the work group said? They did great work, and we have a history of really teaching Indigenous studies in the state that seems to be being minimized. Thank you.
Thanks for the question. So there is a lot of misinformation floating around, and I've had the opportunity to visit with school leaders and tribal councilmen in many communities across the state to understand what their understandings are and get correct information and connections made. So that's a part of this process, right? Each of us brings our own context and experience, and the context of education standards is a unique space, and this experience certainly has shown me just how unique it is. Within the content standards, which are learning expectations for students, standards are a framework for what we want students to know and be able to do at each grade level. Those are set by the state. Curriculum decisions, instructional materials, textbooks, lesson planning, those are decisions made at the local level through school districts, teachers, curriculum directors, school leaders. So I just want to make sure we're all in the same frame of reference around what are standards versus what is curriculum. Within that space, South Dakota has standards for social studies. We've got standards for health science, English. We also have the Oceti-Sakowin Essential Understandings, which are standards for cultural aspects and some history of our Native American peoples, the Oceti-Sakowin, who are the Dakota, Nakota, and Lakota people who are in South Dakota. And so you have to think about, again, in the context, all of those resources and expectations for learning in partnership. So the work group this summer incorporated several of those OSEUs, replicated them into the social studies standards, and in other ways called out history and cultural aspects of the Native American people, which were fantastic. And in an ideal situation, I think could be considered. So we think about standards in a framework for learning. What is the learning we expect of all of our students? Here's what's really important. It is absolutely essential that our South Dakota students understand Native American history and how our South Dakota communities, including tribal communities, come together and work together. That is absolutely important. And in no way was the proposal to take away either the Oceti-Sakowin Essential Understandings or the teaching of Native history. An example of a change that was made in the standards, and I should back up, each of these revision processes compares the last standards. So for social studies, that was in 2015, the last standards were adopted. Look at 2015 and decide where we want to go forward in 2021. The committee recommended increasing the history taught, the culture taught for our Native American peoples, and we agreed with that. The committee also did a beautiful job of increasing the history, the geography, the government aspects of South Dakota in general. In 2015, we only had South Dakota history taught at 4th grade. They incorporated South Dakota history throughout the grade spans, which I think was a really good move. So there were several very strong elements. But an example, the standards, again, are high-level expectations for learning that get translated through curriculum in the classroom. I think it was in the 1st grade, one of the recommendations was for a specific religious tradition of the Native American people to be taught. We don't specify any other religious tradition specifically be taught at a grade level, and so we broaden that standard for teachers to be able to teach the cultural elements of the people that make up their community, including Native Americans. And so we wanted to be very careful to balance content, to increase the history expectations for our Native American people and our South Dakota history, which was done. So there's a lot of misunderstanding. Back to your initial question, why are we in this place? Why don't we go back to that? Or why do we continue forward with another look or continued discussion? That's really at the heart of it. There's a lot of misunderstanding, and this is an opportunity to bring folks together, make sure that we're on the same page and that we feel really strongly the standards we set in place going forward represent South Dakota values. Yeah, thank you. Any other questions as we wrap up?
With all the problems we have with COVID and society today, why are some of your colleagues dwelling on critical race theory and teaching the children that they don't have a mother, they have a birthing parent?
Great question. So there's a lot of aspects in there. COVID, critical race theory, different approaches to people's identities. We're at an interesting societal crossroads of how we function together. And I think at the beginning I shared with you, I'm so proud of our educators for prioritizing kids, their learning, and showing good examples of resiliency and perseverance. Our kids are watching how we have conversations on topics we don't all necessarily agree with. I think all of us in the room have a responsibility for setting a good example of civility and civil discourse when we don't agree, and coming together, working together, and supporting our families and community as we go forward. So certainly we have topics that are tough to deal with, and we'll continue to have those, but let's all remember that we're doing this work in the interest of our young people, and they're watching us very carefully in terms of how we play out and how we have these conversations.
Thank you, Madam Secretary. First of all, I'd like to thank Dakota Wesleyan, Dr. Creasy, and your staff for allowing us to have this gathering here today and for all the help accommodating us. I'd like to thank each of you for your care and concern for our children and for the future of South Dakota and for their futures. And lastly, I'd like to recognize how fortunate we are and to thank Secretary Sanderson for coming and sharing with us today, for taking all your questions. I think she has a few minutes afterwards for private questions or individual questions, but thank you so much for sharing this time with us and bringing what's going on in Pierre to the people of Mitchell and this region. So with that, we're adjourned, and have a good day, everyone. Thanks for coming.